Alaska, a territory for the physically and mentally strong. Good evening, friends. Tonight, we venture into the frozen darkness of Alaska, where only the strong survive. These terrifying tales will test your nerves. I'd like to know your location and what time you're watching from. Leave your like and subscribe to the channel. Help me reach 1,000 subscribers and unlock more chilling stories from the last frontier. Welcome to the cold, if you dare. I need to tell you about the breathing. Not what we found at the camp, the boots, the rifle, the wallet with $3,000 folded inside like someone had been planning to run. Not the fougera that had gone cold less than a day before we arrived. All of that came later, and all of that was horrifying in its own right, the kind of horror that makes you go quiet inside and stay quiet for a long time afterward. But the thing that dismantled me, the thing I still wake up replaying at 3 a.m. in my apartment in Fairbanks where I now sleep with the deadbolt and the chain, was the breathing. 40 meters inside the tree line. Patient. Controlled. A column of condensation rising slowly in the frozen air, the breath of something that did not want us to know it was there, and yet was not quite able to stop itself from being alive. Let me give you the ordinary version first, because these things always begin ordinary. They begin with a gear list and a weather forecast and a group text where everyone sends the same jokes they send every year about not shooting each other. That's how it started, a group text. Me, Gary, and Dan. 3 guys in our late 30s who had been hunting together for 11 years, since the first time Gary's uncle took us out into the Talkeetna Mountains, and we spent 4 days getting miserably cold and seeing exactly nothing and came back feeling like we'd accomplished something real. That feeling is the reason people do this. That's the whole reason. You live in Fairbanks or Anchorage or Wasilla and you work your desk job or your oil field rotation and your life is email and mortgage payments and the particular low-grade despair of American routine, and then once a year you drive out past where the roads stop being roads and you become briefly, badly, honestly alive. We planned 5 days in the interior, a remote stretch of taiga east of Nenana, a long flat river drainage we'd hunted twice before without incident. Moose country. The kind of terrain that looks simple on a map, open boreal forest, a river drainage cutting through, a few ridge lines, and turns out, on the ground, to be an absolute maze of alder thickets and creek crossings and identical spruce groves where your compass becomes the only honest thing in the world. No cell signal past Nenana. No people, or almost none, which was the point. We had a sat phone for emergencies and a wall tent and enough food for a week and the collective confidence of men who have done a thing enough times to forget what it felt like to be afraid of it. That forgetting is the most dangerous thing you can do in Alaska. We drove out from Fairbanks on a Tuesday, the 3 of us in Gary's F-250 with the camper shell loaded with gear, the highway rolling north and west through country that gets emptier by the mile. Nenana is a small town on the Tanana River, a few hundred people, a bridge, a gas station where we stopped for coffee and to top off the tank, because it would be the last gas for a very long time in any direction. The woman behind the counter had the particular face of someone who has watched a lot of people drive away from the last gas station and thought privately about how many of them fully understood what they were driving into. She didn't say anything. She just handed me my change. We parked the truck at a pull-out 12 miles past the end of the maintained road and packed it on foot, 6 miles to the campsite we used before, a gravel bar on the river with a good stand of spruce on 3 sides and clear sight lines in every direction. The walk-in was fine. Everything was fine. November cold, maybe 10 degrees, with the sky that particular shade of pale gray it gets in interior Alaska when there's weather coming but not yet, a hell-breath sky, a sky that's deciding something. We got to the gravel bar by mid-afternoon and set up the wall tent and cut firewood and ate canned chili and everything was ordinary and good. The first 2 days were exactly what we come for. Gary spotted a bull moose at dawn on day 2, 800 yards out across an open drainage, and we spent 4 hours working a careful approach that ultimately came to nothing when the wind shifted and the bull vanished into the spruce like smoke. We didn't care. The not getting is part of it. Dan made coffee over the camp stove and we sat in the thin November sun and talked about nothing in particular: Gary's kids starting to walk, Dan's ex-wife's new boyfriend, my ongoing inability to maintain houseplants, and the smallness of those topics against the enormous, indifferent Alaskan sky was not depressing but clarifying, the way it's clarifying to stand next to a mountain and remember your actual scale. I did think, sitting there, about whether this was worth it. Whether any of it was worth it, the distance from everything familiar, the cold, the complete erasure of modern infrastructure, the fact that if something went wrong out here, really wrong, the cavalry was not coming in any hurry. Fairbanks felt like a different country. Columbus or Seattle or any of the places you could live a soft, connected, protected American life might as well have been on another planet. I thought about my sister, who every year said she didn't understand why I did this, who said the same thing her husband said, that Alaska was a place people went to disappear. I always told her that was the point. Standing there in the November quiet, I was less certain. But then the sun hit the mountains to the north and turned them a color that doesn't exist anywhere else, and I stopped thinking about it. The camp appeared on day 3. We had pushed east along the river drainage, following moose sign, tracks in the riverbank mud, fresh shrubs on the willows, a day-old bed in a spruce thicket that still held the warmth in of something large. The sign led us maybe 4 miles from our camp, into a section of the drainage we hadn't worked before, a narrowing canyon where the spruce grew close and the river bent around a gravel bar and the light came down at a low angle that made everything look slightly unreal, slightly staged. The tent was orange. Not a hunting tent, a lightweight backpacking tent, the kind you buy at REI for summer expeditions, a 3-season tent that had no business being out in interior Alaska in November. It was pitched on the far end of the gravel bar, half in the willows, and it had the collapsed look of something that had lost its internal temperature, no frost melting off the rain fly, no warm haze above the peak. Empty for a while. Gary held up his hand and we all stopped. We stood at the edge of the tree line for 2 full minutes, watching. Nothing moved. There was no sound except the river. We crossed the gravel bar slowly, the 3 of us in a loose line, and I want to say that I felt something even then, some animal register of wrongness that preceded understanding, but honestly I'm not sure I felt anything except curiosity. The curiosity is what I regret now. We should have turned around. The fire ring was 50 feet from the tent, river rocks arranged in a careful circle, hardwood ash inside that had gone fully cold but held its shape, no wind had disturbed it, which meant it hadn't been cold long. 18 hours, I guess now. Maybe 24. The firewood stacked beside it was substantial, enough for several more days, the kind of preparedness that costs effort. Whoever had been here had planned to stay. Dan found the food cache first, a dry bag hung from a spruce branch at the tree line, properly secured against bears, tied with a trucker's hitch that spoke of real backcountry experience. Gary found the pack frame leaning against a spruce trunk, an old external frame with the hip belt loosened, as if someone had taken it off in a hurry. And I found the rifle. It was a bolt-action, a 30-06, propped against the end of the tent with the action open and the scope caps on. A serious rifle. The kind of rifle you take when you mean it. I did not touch it. I crouched next to it and looked at it without touching it, the way you look at something that doesn't make sense yet, waiting for the sense to arrive. The boots were inside the tent, unlaced and paired neatly, heavy sorrel packs rated to -40. In November in interior Alaska. Someone had taken off their primary winter boots and left them inside their tent and left their rifle propped outside and walked away barefoot or in camp shoes into 30-degree cold and had not come back. The sleeping bag inside was expensive, down-filled, in a compression sack with the name of a shop in Boise, Idaho written in Sharpie on the label. Gary found the pack. It was a small day pack, tucked under the fly of the tent, a black Osprey, and inside, a driver's license from Idaho, a man, early 40s, with one of those faces that looks friendly in a photo the way that means nothing, a credit card, a hunting license for the state of Alaska with a Fairbanks address written in the name section, a folded paper topographic map with a route marked in pencil, and the money. We counted it carefully, the three of us crouched in a tight circle, and it was $2,840 in mixed bills, organized by denomination in a rubber band, the kind of organization that is either compulsive neatness or the preparation of someone who planned to operate without a paper trail. Dan said we should take it. He said it in the half-joking voice people use when they're not entirely joking, and Gary told him to shut up, and then none of us said anything for a while. The silence of that place, I want you to understand the silence of that place. We were in a canyon in interior Alaska on a cloudy November afternoon, 4 miles from our own camp, 12 miles from our truck, 60-odd miles from Nenana, 110 from Fairbanks. The silence was not peaceful. It was the silence of a place that has absorbed sound for longer than human beings have made it, that will absorb sound long after we're gone, that holds no particular opinion about what happens inside it. The tent, the boots, the rifle, the cash, all of it was being absorbed by that silence. It would all be covered by the first snow, smoothed over, incorporated. Alaska does not preserve the evidence of what happens inside it. That's not indifference. That's something more final than indifference. I was the one who saw it first. I had stood up from the crouch and stepped back from the pack and was looking at the tree line, not looking for anything, just looking, the way your eyes find the middle distance when you're trying to think, and the condensation appeared between two spruce trunks at the far edge of the gravel bar. 40 meters. A thin plume of exhaled breath, backlit by the gray sky, rising and dispersing in the still cold air. 1 breath. 2. Steady. Controlled. Someone was standing in those trees watching us. And they were standing completely still. I did not move. This is the thing I find hardest to explain to people who weren't there. I did not move, did not call out to Gary or Dan, did not do anything for what felt like a long time. There is a specific paralysis that comes not from fear exactly but from the collision of fear with incomprehension, the moment when your brain registers a threat but cannot construct the category it belongs to. A bear, you know what to do. A person who announces themselves, who calls out, who steps from the trees with their hands visible, you know what to do. A person standing motionless in the tree line at 40 meters watching you silently while you handle their missing companion's belongings in a remote canyon where no one knows you are, there is no protocol for that. The protocol gap is where the terror lives. I watched the condensation for 6 breaths. Then it stopped. They had controlled their breathing. I said, very quietly, Gary. Nothing else. Just his name. Gary was experienced enough that a quiet single-word utterance was sufficient. He came to stand next to me and I pointed with my eyes and he looked for a few seconds and then he said, also quietly, Dan. Walk with me. Now. We walked. Not running, Gary's decision and the right one, because running is a trigger for certain things and we did not know what thing was in those trees. We walked at a measured pace across the gravel bar and into the spruce on the opposite side, and then we moved fast, really fast, the way you move when the animal part of your brain has finally overwhelmed the reasoning part and has been given permission to act. We didn't speak. Dan kept looking back, and each time he looked back I had to force myself not to look because I was afraid of what looking would confirm. We moved for 20 minutes without stopping, cutting north through the spruce toward the river drainage, using the water sound to navigate when the lights started failing. Gary had the compass and used it. My heart was doing something that didn't feel entirely survivable, not a cardiac event, just the percussion of genuine sustained fear, the body spending its reserves, paying the full cost of a threat it could not measure. We had 3 rifles between us. That should have been reassuring. It was not. We made our camp at dusk, rebuilt the fire to something aggressive and well-fed, and sat around it for a long time without eating. Dan finally said, "Was it him? The guy whose stuff, was it him watching us?" Nobody answered. Because there are two answers to that question and neither of them is acceptable. If it was the man whose camp we found, if the owner of the Idaho license, the cash, the careful boots, was standing in those trees watching us, then where had he been for the previous 18 hours? Why was he watching rather than approaching? Why, when 3 armed hunters appeared at his abandoned camp, did he choose concealment over contact? People who have had accidents don't hide from rescuers. People who need help don't control their breathing to avoid detection. And if it was not him, if the figure in the trees had no connection to the abandoned camp, was simply a separate presence in that remote drainage, watching for its own reasons, then the man from Idaho was somewhere else. And the somewhere else of that man, the shape of his absence against the evidence of his careful preparations, his properly hung food cache, his professionally built fire ring, was the most frightening thing I had encountered that day. More frightening than the breathing. More frightening than the stillness. We broke camp at 4 a.m. and walked out in the dark. 6 miles with headlamps in the Alaskan night, not speaking, taking turns on point, every shadow a problem that needed to be solved and discarded. The temperature had dropped to -15. My face went numb inside the first mile and I let it stay numb because the cold was at least honest, at least known, at least something I could name. We reached the truck at first light. Gary called the Alaska State Troopers on the sat phone before we drove out. The trooper he reached, a unit out of Nenana, asked the right questions in the procedurally calm voice of someone who has received many calls from the backcountry and learned to extract information without projecting alarm onto the caller. Gary gave the coordinates. Described the camp, the contents, the license, the cache. Described what we saw at the tree line. The troopers said they would investigate. He took our names and numbers and said someone would be in contact. I drove because Gary's hands weren't steady. The highway back toward Fairbanks felt like a different category of reality, the pavement, the mile markers, the occasional headlights of an oncoming vehicle, all of it speaking the language of the maintained world, the world that has decided to be inhabited and has committed resources toward that decision. I had spent the last 4 days outside that world and something in me was having trouble sliding back inside it cleanly. I thought about what my sister had said. That Alaska was a place people went to disappear. She meant it as a comment on a certain personality type, the loner, the escapist, the man who can't sustain ordinary civilization and retreats to somewhere that doesn't require it. She said it with a mild contempt that I always resisted. I didn't resist it anymore. The troopers' follow-up call came 8 days later. They had located the camp. They had collected the evidence and run the ID. The man from Idaho had been reported missing by a family member 11 days earlier, his wife, who said he had told her he was going on a solo hunting trip in the Fairbanks area and had failed to return as scheduled. The investigation was open. The troopers said this carefully, the way you say something when you want to convey that it is serious without conveying that it is hopeless. I asked if they had any leads. He said they were pursuing several lines of inquiry. I asked about the figure in the trees. He said they had found no evidence of a second individual in the area, but that the terrain made comprehensive searching difficult. Difficult. In a drainage where a man had vanished, leaving his boots and his rifle and $3,000. Difficult. The man from Idaho has not been found as of this writing. His name appears occasionally in a forum for missing persons in Alaska, one of those websites that are maintained by people with too much heart and too little power, updated with information that comes in slowly and means less and less as time passes. His wife posted there once, a short post, asking if anyone had information. 9 people responded. None of them had information. I still go to Fairbanks. I still live here, which surprises people when I tell them this story. They ask why I stay, and I don't have a clean answer. There's something about this place, even now, even knowing what I know, that makes every other place feel thin. The lower 48 feels like an argument about things that don't ultimately matter. Fairbanks in November is cold enough to be honest. The dark is real dark, not the half-dark of cities that can't commit to night. Out past Nenana, past the end of the maintained roads, there is something that exists on its own terms, that was here before us and will be hereafter, and that neither needs us nor is entirely indifferent to our presence. Something that watches. Something that waits. Jerry doesn't hunt anymore. He didn't announce it, he just didn't confirm the trip the following November, didn't respond to the group text the way he always had, and when I finally called him he said he'd been thinking about taking up golf. We both understood what that meant. Dan still goes. But he goes closer to Fairbanks now, in areas with more foot traffic, more hunters, more voices in the woods. He bought a new rifle and a personal locator beacon and a backup locator beacon and a spare sat phone battery. He says he's fine. He says it the way people say things they need to keep saying until saying it makes it true. I went back once. Not to the drainage, I'm not that gone, I'm not that broken. Just to the river north of Nenana, a stretch I know well, open country, nothing threatening. I sat on a gravel bar in the November light and listened to the water and thought about the man from Idaho, about his careful fire ring and his properly stored food and his brand new hunting license with the Fairbanks address, about all the preparation that had not been enough. I thought about the figure in the trees, the controlled breath, the stillness of something that had decided to be invisible and nearly succeeded. I sat there until the light failed. Then I stood up and walked back to the truck and drove toward Fairbanks with the heater on full and every mirror checked and both hands on the wheel. The wilderness doesn't chase you. That's what people don't understand. It doesn't have to. It just waits for the moment when you forget that you are a visitor here, when you start to feel at home in a place that has never considered you at home, and then it shows you something, a cold fire ring, a pair of boots left behind, a column of breath between the trees that resets the terms. You are not from here. You are not known here. And whatever watches from the tree line has all the time in the world. I want to be precise about what I found, because imprecision is what lets people dismiss things like this. They round the horror down into something manageable. They say a camera and pictures something small and embarrassing, a creep with too much free time and a laptop. They do not picture what I pictured, a man who had been watching me sleep. A man who knew my name before I gave it to him. A man who had built something patient and meticulous inside the walls of a cabin I rented for 7 days of what I had told myself was healing. Let me start somewhere ordinary, because that's where it actually started, not in Alaska, not in the dark, but in a Walgreens parking lot in Columbus, Ohio, on a Tuesday afternoon in late October, when my marriage ended not with screaming but with a text message. 14 years. The kind of marriage where you stop noticing each other, where the silence at dinner has stopped being companionable and started being its own kind of sentence. Marcus didn't even come home that night. He sent a text. I sat in the Walgreens parking lot for 40 minutes with the engine running, and when I finally went inside to buy cold medicine, which is what I had gone for in the first place, I stood in the coffee and cold aisle and thought, I need to go somewhere that has nothing to do with any of this. The cabin appeared in a search 3 days later. Airbnb, listed under the name Northern Solitude Retreat. Palmer, Alaska. 90 minutes north of Anchorage, in the Mananuska-Susitna Valley, a place that sounded like it had been named by someone who wanted you to feel small. The listing photographs were stunning in the way Alaskan things are stunning, not beautiful, exactly, but enormous. The kind of landscape that doesn't care whether you're there or not. That was exactly what I wanted. A place that didn't care. A place that had never heard of Marcus, never heard of Columbus, and no opinion whatsoever about 14 years of accumulated silence. The host's name was listed as Art Callahan. Profile photo: a middle-aged man in a Carhartt jacket, squinting in the sun, holding a fish the way people hold fish in profile photos, like evidence of a normal life. 5-star rating. 42 reviews. The reviews said things like incredibly peaceful and exactly as described, and you will not want to leave. One woman from Portland wrote that she'd cried on the last morning because she didn't want to go back to real life. I booked 7 nights. I flew into Ted Stevens Anchorage International Airport on a Sunday. The descent alone was enough to make me understand I had done something irreversible. The mountains came up through the clouds like teeth. The inlet below was the color of pewter, flat and massive and cold in a way that looked permanent rather than seasonal. I had lived in Ohio my whole life. I had never seen anything that looked like it didn't need humanity to justify its existence. This did not look like it needed us. I rented a Subaru Outback, practically required by Alaskan law, the rental agent joked, and drove the Glen Highway north toward Palmer while the last light died around 3 in the afternoon. November in south central Alaska. The darkness comes early and it comes completely, not the polite dimming you get in Ohio, but a blackout, a curtain dropped. By the time I reached the turn-off for the cabin, the headlights were carving narrow tunnels through spruce trees so dense they looked like walls, and I remember thinking, very clearly, if something went wrong out here, no one would find you for a long time. I filed that thought the way you file thoughts that make you uncomfortable, quickly, toward the back. The cabin was exactly as described. Small, cedar, with a wood stove I didn't know how to use and a wall of windows that faced a frozen creek. The nearest neighbor was a quarter-mile away, invisible through the trees. The nearest town was Wasilla, 23 minutes south, the same Wasilla that sits quiet and unremarkable next to its highway, a gas station and a Walmart and a McDonald's that somehow feels wrong so far from the lower 48. Beyond Wasilla was Anchorage. Beyond Anchorage was everything else. There was a quality to the isolation that felt less like privacy and more like erasure. Standing on the porch that first night, breath fogging, listening to nothing, no traffic, no sirens, no neighbor's television, I felt something I can only describe as the specific loneliness of being alive in a place that has no record of you. No one in Palmer knew I existed. No one in Anchorage. No one within 1,000 miles. I had wanted that. Standing there, I wasn't entirely sure I still did. But the first few days were fine. Better than fine. I slept 10 hours a night under quilts stacked like layers of sediment. I drank coffee watching the creek ice. I read 2 novels I bought at the airport, the kind of paperbacks you buy because the cover looks like nothing and costs nothing, and that's exactly the right amount. I cried twice, once on the second morning, looking at a photo of Marcus and me at a friend's wedding 4 years ago, and once on the third night, for no reason I could identify, just sitting by the wood stove with the feeling that my life had been happening to someone else and I had only just noticed. It was the third night when I first heard the sound in the wall. I told myself it was an animal. Palmer is bear country, moose country, the kind of place where the local Facebook groups have weekly posts about what's been seen in which yard. The sound was low, intermittent, like something dragging slowly across wood inside the wall to the right of the bed. I lay still for 10 minutes listening to it, and then it stopped and I slept. In the morning I looked up animals in Cabin Walls, Alaska, and read about red squirrels, about martens, about the creative and destructive ways small wildlife finds warmth in winter. This satisfied me enough. The second night I heard it, the explanation was less satisfying. It wasn't dragging this time. It was rhythmic. Patient. A slow, deliberate sound, like fingers moving across a surface with intention rather than desperation. Fingers don't sound like animal claws. Claws are irregular, skittering, alive with animal anxiety. This was slow. This was measured. I sat up in bed and listened for 11 minutes, I know because I watched the clock on my phone, and the sound continued at the same pace and then simply stopped. Not trailing off the way an animal stops, not interrupted, just finished. The way you'd stop if you decided you were done. I turned on every light in the cabin. I want to stop here and acknowledge the self-doubt that comes with these moments. I was a recently separated woman in a remote cabin, sleeping alone for the first time in over a decade, in a state I'd never visited, 3,000 miles from anyone who knew my face. I was primed for fear. I was marinating in vulnerability. It is entirely reasonable to wonder whether the sounds were real, whether loneliness and dislocation had started manufacturing menace out of ordinary winter noise. I wondered that. I convinced myself of it, briefly, the way you convince yourself of comfortable things when the alternative is too cold to hold. On the 5th night, I pushed the armoire. I don't know what made me do it, some accumulation of rawness that hadn't crystallized into thought yet, just a physical instinct, the body knowing something the mind hadn't formulated. The armoire was old, pine, bolted to the baseboard on 2 sides. When I unbolted the baseboard brackets and pushed, it moved about 8 inches before catching. Behind it was a section of wall that looked identical to the rest of the wall. Except for a seam. A rectangular seam, the width of a door that had been painted over. And at the bottom right of that seam, a circular hole approximately the diameter of a quarter, plugged with dark foam rubber. I stood there for a very long time. The foam rubber came out easily when I pulled it. Behind it was darkness, and the faint smell of something, cigarette smoke, I would later identify, though in that moment I couldn't name it, couldn't name anything, standing barefoot on the cold floor in the dark cabin at 1:47 in the morning with a hole in my wall that led somewhere I couldn't see. I found a flashlight in the kitchen drawer. I shone it through the hole. The lens of a camera looked back at me. I did not scream. I think about this sometimes, why I didn't scream. I think it's because the horror was so complete, so total, that it bypassed the scream and went somewhere deeper. It went to the place that makes decisions. Within 60 seconds I had put on shoes and a coat and I was outside in the frozen dark, standing next to my rental car, calling 911 with hands that were shaking enough that I misdialed twice. The Matanuska-Susitna Borough Trooper arrived 41 minutes later. His name was written on a card he gave me after. I barely looked at it. He was calm with the practice calm of someone who covers 400 square miles of ground and has learned that calm is the most useful thing he can bring to a scene. He looked at the hole in the wall. He pushed the armoire further. He found the false door. Behind it, a narrow maintenance corridor, 2 feet wide, running the length of the bedroom wall. And in that corridor, a camping stool, a power strip tapped into the cabin's wiring, 2 cameras mounted on brackets with clear sightlines through pre-drilled holes, a space heater, a sleeping bag, and a milk crate with 4 external hard drives stacked neatly on top of one another. 4 hard drives. Let me sit with that for a moment, because I need you to understand what 4 hard drives means. Not one. Not a single camera, a single impulse, a single crime committed in a moment of disturbing curiosity. 4 drives, organized, labeled. I would learn later that they were labeled by year. 4 years of footage. The trooper, looking at the drives in the glow of his flashlight, made a sound I had never heard a professional make before. A small sound. An involuntary sound. He turned to look at me and then quickly looked away. The investigation revealed things in stages, the way these things do, each new piece arriving like a diagnosis you had half expected but couldn't prepare for. The cameras had been installed by a man whose name I will not write here, but who had owned the cabin for 6 years before listing it on Airbnb. He had not listed it for income. He had listed it because the platform provided him with a supply of strangers delivered to his corridor unaware. The footage on the 4 drives contained images of 112 guests. Couples. Families. A man traveling alone who appeared, from the footage, to be in significant emotional distress. A teenage girl who had come with her parents. The drives were organized not just by year but by folder, and the folders were named. My folder was named with my full name. He knew my name before I arrived. He had accessed my Airbnb profile. He had possibly accessed more than that. The investigation was ongoing while I left Alaska and, to my knowledge, remains ongoing, the tendrils of it reaching into corners of the internet that the trooper explained to me in a flat, factual voice that I think he used specifically because any other tone would have been unbearable. Art Callahan had been in that corridor. The question of when, whether on any of my 7 nights, whether sitting 12 inches from my sleeping body, separated by cedar and plaster, was never conclusively answered. I flew out of Anchorage on a Friday morning. I remember looking out the airplane window as we lifted and watching the valley fall away, the Matanuska River white and frozen below, the Talkeetna Mountains ahead, everything enormous and cold and utterly without interest in what had just happened to me. I thought about the woman from Portland who had cried because she didn't want to leave. I thought about myself 3 days earlier, standing on that porch in the dark, feeling erased by the scale of the place. I had thought that erasure was what I wanted. I had not understood that erasure is only bearable when you're the one choosing it. Alaska asks a specific question of the people who go there, especially the ones who go alone. It asks, do you know the difference between solitude and abandonment? Do you know what it costs to be unknown? I had gone to Palmer to be nowhere, to be no one, to slip out of the story of my life for a week and breathe air that didn't know my name. I had believed that invisibility was mine to choose. But invisibility is not something you can choose. It is something that is done to you, or not done to you, by other people. The moment you step outside the web of people who know your face, you are not invisible, you are simply unseen by the people who would protect you. You remain entirely visible to everyone else. I moved out of the Columbus apartment 2 months later. I changed my name on every platform I could find. I no longer book vacation rentals through any platform that requires my real name to be attached to a location. I sleep with a flashlight within reach, which is a sentence that would have sounded paranoid to me 18 months ago and now sounds simply accurate. Art Callahan was arrested in Wasilla on a Thursday in January. The charge that will most likely result in a conviction, according to the prosecutor's email, is distribution of intimate imagery, a federal charge now, carrying real weight. But he had lived freely for 6 years. 6 years of footage, 4 drives, 112 people who did not know they were being watched, sleeping in the dark in a place so far from everything that even the police took 41 minutes to arrive. And when he is sentenced, if he is sentenced, in the way these things sometimes do not fully resolve, the corridor will still exist. The hole in the wall will have been filled by then. The cabin will almost certainly be relisted under a different name. The 42 reviews are still online as of the last time I checked. The woman from Portland who cried when she didn't want to leave, I think about her. I hope she never knows. I hope the not knowing is a mercy. I hope she remembers that weak is the peaceful, restorative thing she believed it was and goes on believing it, and that the folder with her name on it, if there is one, I don't know, I stopped asking, remains sealed inside an evidence locker in a Wasilla police facility, and that she is never called to learn what it contains. I am not that lucky. I know what mine contains. I have not watched it. I have been told, in the careful language of a victim's advocate, that watching it is my right and also my choice, and that many people choose not to, and that this choice is entirely valid. I have made this choice. I will continue to make it every day for as long as it takes. Palmer, Alaska. 90 minutes north of Anchorage, in the Matanuska-Susitna Valley. The photographs in the listing really were stunning. The creek really did freeze over. The mountains really were there, enormous and indifferent and cold, not caring whether I existed. That part, at least, was exactly as described. I want to be precise about what I am before I tell you what happened to me. Precision matters here, because the moment I describe what I experienced, the figure under the streetlight, the scratches on the sill, the shadow at the top of the stairs, I can already feel the skepticism building in the reader the way it built in every person I tried to tell at the time. So let me preempt it. I am a healthcare consultant, methodical by training and by temperament, with a graduate degree from Indiana University and 11 years of professional experience that required, above all else, the ability to distinguish between evidence and interpretation. I am not imaginative in the way that produces phantoms. I am imaginative in the way that produces spreadsheets. What happened to me was not a product of anxiety or isolation or the particular psychological weight of a woman living alone for the first time in a new city at the edge of the continent. What happened to me was real, documented, and witnessed by at least one detective from the Anchorage Police Department who used the word fixation in my presence without being asked. I arrived in Anchorage on March 1st of a year I will not specify because the man whose name I was never officially given is still, as far as I know, alive and unconfined. I had taken a 1-year contract position with a healthcare consulting firm headquartered on C Street. Good work, good money, the kind of professional opportunity that requires a specific context to make sense, and the context was this. I had been in a relationship for 4 years that had ended 7 months earlier, badly, and I had spent those 7 months in Indianapolis doing the slow, effortful work of rebuilding a sense of self that the relationship had, incrementally and without drama, dismantled. My therapist used the word erosion. I thought that was accurate. I had been eroded. I needed somewhere with weather. Alaska was not a whim. I had researched the position thoroughly, had asked the right questions during the interview process, and mapped the city using Google Street View the way people do when they are trying to assess a place they've never been. I had noted the proximity to the Chugach Mountains, the presence of a decent trail system, the surprising sophistication of the restaurant scene along Spenard Road. I had, in the way of a competent professional managing a significant life transition, prepared. What I had not prepared for was the specific quality of the isolation, not the physical isolation, not the darkness or the cold, but the social isolation, the particular loneliness of a person 3,000 miles from everyone who knew their face, in a city that had not yet decided whether to know them. Indianapolis is not a warm city in the emotional sense, but it is a known city. 31 years had stitched me into it in the small ways that accumulate into infrastructure, the dry cleaner on 46th Street who remembered my standing order, the coffee shop on College Avenue where they started my drink when they saw me come through the door, the grocery store where I knew which self-checkout machines were slow and which produce section got restocked on Wednesday mornings. Anchorage had none of this yet. Anchorage was legible only as a map and a weather forecast and a commute. I was, for the first time in my adult life, genuinely unknown. I should have understood what that meant. I didn't, not yet. The apartment was on a residential block east of downtown, a 2-story building, 2nd floor, rear-facing unit. My bedroom window looked out over a side street and the gap between 2 houses across the way, and on the corner of that side street there was a street light of the older sodium vapor type that cast a warm amber circle on the sidewalk below it. I noticed the light on my first night because it was visible through the curtains I had not yet fully adjusted, a warm orange pulse in the darkness. I did not, that night, notice the figure beneath it. I noticed him on the 14th night. I know it was the 14th because of the journal. My therapist back in Indianapolis had suggested keeping one during the transition, and I had, with the slightly embarrassed diligence of a person who finds the practice self-indulgent but cannot argue with its utility. March 14th. I have written about the grocery run on Northern Lights Boulevard, about the colleague who had asked me to lunch for the 3rd time and whose persistence I had not yet decided how to read. And at the bottom of the page, in handwriting that was slightly different from the rest, smaller, tighter, the handwriting of someone who is writing something they are not sure deserves to be written, *man under the light again. Still there for the whole time I was watching. Didn't move, asterisk. Again. I had written again. Which means some registration had occurred before the 14th night that I had not consciously elevated to observation. The body keeping its own records, below the threshold of the part of my mind that organizes things into problems worth solving. He was average in almost every visible measure. Winter coat, dark, the kind sold by the thousands at every sporting goods store in Alaska. Standing height. Face turned toward the building. Not toward my window, toward the building, the way you'd look at an address you were confirming. He stood directly beneath the light, which I would later spend considerable time thinking about. The instinct of surveillance is to use shadow. A person watching from concealment moves away from the light source. This man stood in it. I did not know what to make of that yet. For 2 weeks I told myself the explanations. A person waiting for someone. A resident of the neighboring houses, an insomniac who found the cold clarifying, someone with a dog who occasionally wandered. I told myself these things with decreasing conviction across 14 more nights until the pattern became undeniable in the specific way that only patterns can, not a single alarming event, but an accumulation of data points that achieves, at some threshold, the weight of certainty. 11:47 p.m. Arrival time consistent across 23 documented nights, with a variance of under 4 minutes. Duration between 35 minutes and 2 hours. Departure never witnessed, present, then absent, with no transition captured. I had begun checking my phone when I noticed him, so the times were precise. I had begun writing the duration down, and then the temperature, and then a brief physical description as best I could gather from the second floor at 40 feet. The journal had become something else. It had become evidence, though I did not use that word yet. The Anchorage police officer who came in response to my call was professional in the way that Anchorage police are professional, capable, slightly overextended, operating in a jurisdiction that covers an enormous amount of complicated ground. She walked the block. She stood at the corner. She explained, with genuine patience, that a person standing on a public sidewalk presented no actionable legal situation, and that the most she could offer was an increased patrol presence, which she said with enough self-awareness that I understood she knew what it was worth. She handed me a card with a case number. She said to call if anything escalated. I asked what escalated meant. She met my eyes for a moment before she answered. She said, "You'll know." The cameras I installed the next day were a practical decision made in the manner of all practical decisions under pressure, quickly, without second-guessing, because the alternative to action was waiting, and waiting at a cost I was no longer willing to pay. An IP camera with night vision aimed at the streetlight from inside my bedroom window. A second camera over my front door. I mounted them myself. I configured the cloud storage myself. I set the motion sensitivity and tested the alerts, and then I made dinner and watched television and went to bed in the specific way of a person who has done everything within their power and is now obligated to wait for the results. The motion alert came at 2:17 a.m. on day 31. Not from the window camera. From the door. I reviewed the footage in the morning. The hallway was empty. But at the top of the stairwell, at the extreme edge of the fisheye lens's reach, in the corner of the frame, a shadow with a human shape. Present in frame 3. Absent in frame 4. 1 second of footage containing something that had been at the top of my stairs in the middle of the night and had retreated, or had simply ceased to be visible, which was not the same thing. I went back through 23 days of previous footage. I found 6 additional instances of the stairwell shadow, each between 1 a.m. and 3 a.m., each in a single frame or a run of 2 or 3 frames before disappearing. 7 nights. 7 times something had stood at the top of my stairs while I slept. 7 times it had left. The leaving, I understood, was the only reason I was still alive and capable of reviewing the footage. I want to tell you something about what it does to a person, not the acute fear, which is survivable, but the retrospective fear, the understanding that danger had been present on 7 specific nights and that your sleep had been undisturbed, that you had breathed and turned over and maybe dreamed while something stood outside your door. The acute fear occupies the body and then releases it. The retrospective fear settles in differently. It does not release. It becomes structural, load-bearing, part of the architecture of how you move through rooms and check locks and look at windows. It becomes, in the clinical language my doctor would use some months later, hypervigilance. In plain language, it becomes the state of being permanently positioned at the edge of a danger you cannot confirm is gone. The scratches appeared on a Thursday evening in April. Or rather, I found them on a Thursday evening in April. They could have been there longer. I was closing the bedroom blinds when the angle of the late light, Alaska in April, finally recovering its daylight hours, caught the sill in a way that revealed texture I had not seen before. I opened the window. I leaned out into the cold. I looked. Horizontal scratches in the painted wood, parallel to the sill edge, evenly spaced. Not environmental damage. Not wind-driven grit or ice. Deliberate marks, made by something thin and controlled, a key, a bolt, an implement, in a pattern that was not decorative but operational. The marks of a person finding purchase. The marks of a person who had assessed the exterior of the building and found the window and tried, or prepared, or measured. My bedroom window. 2nd floor. 12 feet off the ground, accessible via a drain pipe 6 feet to the left and a ledge at the floor join below. Accessible to someone who knew what they were doing. Accessible to someone who had looked at it long enough to know. The detective from the threat assessment unit arrived the following morning. I had not known the Anchorage PD had a threat assessment unit until the dispatcher connected me to it, and the existence of such a unit told me more about the nature of what people experienced in this city than anything a resident had said to me in 6 weeks. He was deliberate and precise, and he looked at the scratches with a flashlight and a loupe and he said, "This is recent, this is tool-made, and I am treating this as a serious escalation." He reviewed the camera footage. He asked me questions in a sequence that suggested a protocol, that suggested he had done this before and had learned the optimal order for extracting information from a person who was frightened but trying not to show it. He said, persistent, fixated, and dangerous. 3 words in the flat cadence of a weather report. He asked if I had names. I gave him the list I had made, not because the names were certain but because fear, in the absence of confirmed identity, distributes itself across every recent face. My ex-husband, whose emails I had not answered. A man from an Indianapolis gym who had asked for my number 3 times. A face in the parking garage of my office on C Street that I had maybe recognized and maybe invented. The detective took the list with the expression of someone who had taken many such lists and knew which kinds yielded results. He told me to stay with someone. He said this in the careful, responsible voice of an official who has given advice he knows cannot be followed, who says it anyway because saying it is part of the protocol. I was in Anchorage. I had been there 51 days. The person nearest to me who would take me in without requiring an explanation I wasn't yet capable of giving was in Indianapolis, a 4-hour flight away. I said I would be careful. He said careful wasn't the same thing as safe. I said I knew that. He was right. I knew it then and I know it now. Careful is what you do when safety isn't available. The figure under the streetlight stopped appearing on May 3rd. The stairwell shadow's last recorded appearance was April 28th. A week passed without incident. 2 weeks. The detective called to say that one name from my list had been interviewed and asked formally to cease contact with me, that while the evidence was insufficient for charges, the interview had, he used this phrase, produced the desired behavioral change. He would not tell me the name. I asked twice. He declined both times, citing the ongoing nature of the investigation. I understood that the investigation would end quietly, that no charges would follow, that the name would belong to the category of things I would never be allowed to know. This category is its own form of horror. The unresolved. The unnamed. The threat that didn't end, that merely stopped being visible. I started the medication in June. Clonazepam for sleep, and SSRI for what my doctor on Benson Boulevard called situational anxiety and what I called the entirely reasonable neurological consequences of having documented a stalker for 11 weeks while receiving inadequate institutional protection. The pills were useful. The clonazepam gave sleep a heaviness that was different from rest but was at least sleep. The SSRI took 6 weeks to begin working, and during those 6 weeks I was neither better nor worse but simply suspended, waiting for my own chemistry to shift. I did my work. I was good at my work and I continued to be good at it, which was a source of comfort in the way that competence is always a source of comfort, the professional self persisting while the private self underwent repairs. My colleagues knew something had changed and were tactful about not knowing what. I appreciated the tact more than I would have expected. What the medication could not fix was the window. Every night, regardless of dose, regardless of how much the logical part of my mind recited the facts, he is gone, provisionally, the detective has intervened, the cameras show nothing, my body stood in the bedroom and looked at the window and read it as a threat. Not the man. The window itself. The window that had been touched from outside. The window that looked out over a street that had held him 37 times. The window was no longer a window. It was a record of what had happened, and the record did not respond to medication. There is something about Alaska that makes this kind of fear metastasize in ways it might not elsewhere. Something about the scale of the place, the indifference of the landscape, the specific Alaskan arithmetic of distance and response time, and the thin social infrastructure that exists between a person in trouble and the help they need. In Indianapolis, if I had screamed, someone would have heard. If I had disappeared, the gap would have been noticed in hours. Here, in a building where I knew no one by name, in a city that had not yet finished learning I existed, the gap between my distress and any possible response was longer than felt survivable. I had come to Alaska to be unknown. I had gotten what I asked for. The loneliness of it, not the emotional loneliness, but the operational loneliness, the loneliness of being outside the network of people who would notice your absence, was the thing that Alaska had added to the horror, the amplifier that made what might have been a frightening experience in another city into something that restructured the way I thought about safety for years afterward. I gave notice on the apartment in August and notice on the contract in September, and my employer, with the resigned practicality of a company that has learned the cost of losing good people, converted my role to remote. I packed what I had, which was not much, and I left Anchorage on November 1st, on a morning when the sun rose at 8:44 a.m. and would set at 5:09 p.m. and the light, when it came, was low and sideways and briefly, almost unbearably beautiful. I drove to Miami. I want to be precise about the choice, not flew, drove, 11 days through Canada and down the Eastern Corridor, because I needed to watch the landscape change. I needed the transition to be physical and gradual, the tundra giving way to forest, giving way to farmland, giving way to suburb, giving way to city, the accumulated density of inhabited America reassembling itself around me like a signal returning. By Tennessee, I stopped checking the mirrors every 2 minutes. By Georgia, I turned the radio on. By the time I crossed into Florida, the light was thick and warm and horizontal in a way that had nothing in common with anything I had experienced in the previous 8 months. Miami is many things, most of them loud. My apartment is on the 4th floor of a building with a doorman and hallway cameras and neighbors close enough that their arguments about parking constitute a form of ambient security. I take a half dose of clonazepam now, tapering. My doctor says I'm close to done. I sleep with the blinds open because the first night I simply forgot to close them and woke to sunlight and traffic noise and the sound of 12 million people living their lives with the volume up, and I understood that the crowd was a kind of protection I had not known I needed until I had spent 8 months without it. Somewhere in Alaska, in Anchorage or Eagle River or one of the quiet residential streets that push up toward the Chugach Mountains, a man whose name was withheld from me is living his life. The detective said behavioral change. He did not say rehabilitation. He did not say resolved. He said the desired behavioral change had occurred, which means the behavior had been occurring, which means the behavior could recur. I try not to think about who's on his street now. I try, and most nights I succeed. Most nights. The door handle on my side had been removed. Not broken. Not missing from neglect or age or the slow decay of a working truck driven hard through Alaskan winters. Removed. The hole where the mechanism should have been was clean, slightly beveled at the edges, the kind of precision that requires a tool and a decision in time. I know this because I looked at it for approximately 4 seconds before I understood what I was looking at, and in those 4 seconds the temperature inside the cab of that truck dropped, not the temperature measured by instruments but the other kind, the kind your body takes, the kind that starts in the sternum and radiates outward and does not have a name in any language I know but that every living creature understands as a signal that something has gone irrevocably wrong. I need to back up. I need to give you the ordinary version first, because the ordinary version is the whole point, because what happened to me on the Glen Highway in late November began not with anything dramatic or foreboding but with a dead alternator and a phone showing 2% battery and the specific, mundane vulnerability of being a woman alone on an Alaskan highway at 4 in the afternoon, which is already dark, which is already cold enough that the exposed skin of your face begins to register. Complaint within 60 seconds of stepping outside. My name is Christine Waverly. I was 34 years old, a medical transcriptionist working remotely, living in a rented house in Glen Ellen, a small town on the Glen Highway, population roughly 500, situated in the Copper River Valley about 250 miles east of Anchorage. I had moved there 18 months earlier from Portland, Oregon, following a relationship that had moved there first and then ended, leaving me in a place I had chosen for someone else. I had stayed because the rent was low and the work was remote, and there was something about the valley, the enormous mountains on every side, the Wrangell Range to the east and the Chugach to the south, the sense of being cupped inside something vast and ancient, that I found, in my better moments, genuinely beautiful. In my worst moments I found it the loneliest place I had ever been in my life, which is saying something, because I had been lonely in cities too, and city loneliness and Alaskan loneliness are not the same species. City loneliness is crowded. Alaskan loneliness has room to expand. I had driven to Anchorage for a medical appointment, nothing serious, a follow-up, the kind of errand that takes 2 hours in a city and requires a 500-mile round trip when you live where I lived. I left Anchorage on the return trip at 2 in the afternoon, which should have put me back in Glen Ellen before 7. The alternator died somewhere around mile marker 147, which is to say, nowhere. The Glen Highway between Anchorage and Glen Ellen passes through some of the most geographically spectacular and logistically unforgiving terrain in North America. There are stretches of 50, 60 miles without a structure of any kind. The highway itself is 2 lanes, well maintained, traveled by a combination of locals and truckers and the occasional out-of-state driver who has misjudged what this state actually means when it says remote. My car rolled to the shoulder and stopped. I had enough battery to call AAA, which I did, and the AAA representative told me the wait time for a tow would be approximately 3 hours, which was said in the cheerful tone of someone sitting in a warm office in a city where 3 hours is an inconvenience rather than a survival consideration. The temperature outside was -22 Fahrenheit. I had a coat and boots rated for cold but not for stationary cold, the specific sustained cold of sitting in a dead car on a highway shoulder for 3 hours while the residual engine heat slowly evacuated. I had a half-eaten granola bar and a water bottle that was already starting to freeze along the edges. I thought about what my mother used to say when I told her I was moving to Alaska. She said it the way people say things they know won't be heard. "Christine, that place is not built for people like us." I had been mildly offended at the time. I understood it differently now, sitting in the darkening cab of my dead Subaru at mile 147 with the mountains black against the last gray light and no structure visible in any direction, and the knowledge that if something went wrong out here, genuinely wrong, not broken car wrong but something worse, the response time of any help whatsoever would be measured in hours rather than minutes. The wilderness does not care about your timeline. It does not care about your appointment or your granola bar or the reasonable chain of decisions that led you to this shoulder. It simply is, and you are in it, and those are the terms. The truck appeared from the north about 40 minutes in. A commercial-looking rig, a heavy-duty pickup with a camper shell, moving at highway speed. I had turned on my hazard lights when I pulled over. The truck slowed as it approached and then stopped on the shoulder about 20 feet ahead of me, and the driver got out. He was a big man, mid-50s I would guess, in a Carhartt jacket and insulated work pants, with the kind of face that is immediately readable as friendly, broad, weathered, creased around the eyes in a way that suggests outdoor work and habitual squinting into cold light. He knocked on my passenger window and I rolled it down, and he said his name was Ray and asked what the trouble was, and I told him, and he looked at the hood and said he could give me a lift to the next town, which was Sutton, about 30 miles back west. He said it matter-of-factly, the way Alaskans often operate, practical, no performance, the assumption that people in trouble on the highway get help because that is what you do out here, because everyone who lives here has been that person on the shoulder, will be that person again, and the social contract of the highway is one of the things that makes this place survivable. I called AAA back and redirected the tow to Sutton. I grabbed my bag and my phone charger and locked my car and got into Ray's truck, and he pulled back onto the highway heading west, and for the first 7 or 8 minutes everything was completely ordinary. He talked about the road conditions further north, about a section of ice near the Matanuska Glacier where someone had gone off the shoulder the week before. I asked if the person was okay and he said yes, shaken up but okay, and I said that was lucky, and he said luck mattered a great deal out here. I agreed. I looked out the window at the darkness coming in over the mountains. Then I reached for the door handle. I don't know why I reached for it at that particular moment. Not to get out, we were moving at 60 miles per hour. I think it was automatic, the kind of unconscious orientation a person does in a vehicle, the same instinct that makes you note the exit row on an airplane. My right hand moved to the door and found nothing. Found the clean, beveled hole where the mechanism should have been. And in the 4 seconds that followed, the 4 seconds of looking at it, of understanding what I was looking at, I felt the temperature drop in the way I described, and I became very still, and I kept my face pointed at the window so Ray could not see what was on it. He had been talking about something, the fishing season, I think, something about the Kenai River, and his voice continued at the same pace, and I made a sound that I hoped passed for engagement. I was thinking with the specific, pressurized clarity that extreme fear sometimes produces, the kind of thinking that is not comfortable but is very fast and very precise. The door handle had been removed deliberately. I was in a truck on a 2-lane highway in the dark with a man I did not know, 60 miles from the nearest town of any size, with a phone at 4% battery and a AAA dispatcher who knew I was getting a ride to Sutton and nothing else. I looked at the side mirror. The highway behind us was empty. No headlights in either direction. The mountains on both sides were invisible now, the darkness total, the truck's headlights carving a narrow tunnel through it that made the world outside seem to extend about 50 feet and no further, as if we were moving through something that was generating itself just ahead of us and collapsing just behind. "You warm enough?" Ray said. "Yes," I said. "Thank you." The voice I used was not my voice. It was the voice of someone performing the previous version of the conversation, the one that existed before I found the hole in the door. I was performing a reality that no longer existed because I needed him to believe I was still in it. I became aware of details I had not registered before. The truck's interior was clean in a deliberate way, not the organic clutter of a working vehicle but an empty cleanliness, the kind that suggests recent preparation. There was nothing in the cab, no coffee cup, no receipt, no piece of mail, no detritus of a lived life. The back seat was empty. I could see through the rear window into the camper shell, which was dark, and I could not see what was in it. There was a smell I had taken for pine air freshener when I first got it, and that I now understood was something used to neutralize a different smell, the chemical sweetness of something applied over something else. I thought about a woman named Angela Sanders. I didn't know that name then. I know it now. Know it the way you know things you spend months reading about obsessively in an attempt to understand a thing that happened to you. Angela Sanders had disappeared from the Glen Highway 14 months before my car broke down. She was 29, had been hitchhiking between Palmer and Glen Ellen, and had not been found. Her case was listed as a missing persons investigation. The highway where she disappeared was the same highway I was on. The mile markers overlapped with the stretch where I had broken down. I did not know any of that in the truck. What I knew was the door handle, and the clean cab, and the smell, and the highway that was showing me nothing but darkness in every direction, and the growing certainty, not a feeling, a calculation, assembled from evidence the way you assemble a finding from data points, that I was in serious danger. "I actually think I'm going to be sick," I said. I said it in the middle of a sentence of his about ice fishing, and the interruption was jarring enough that he looked at me, and I kept my face arranged in the expression of someone who is nauseated and embarrassed about it, not the expression of someone who is terrified and buying time. "Car sick," he said. His voice had changed by a fraction. Not dramatically, a fraction, the kind of change that you might not notice if you were not already listening for it with every functional piece of your nervous system. "I get it sometimes," I said. "In trucks especially." "I'm sorry, could you pull over for just a second? I just need a minute of air." There was a pause. 3 seconds, 4. In those seconds I understood that the pause itself was information, that a person who had simply given a stranded stranger a lift would not pause before pulling over for someone who said they were carsick. The pause was a calculation. He was calculating something. And then the truck slowed and moved to the shoulder and stopped, and before it had fully stopped I had my hand on the handle of my bag and was watching the door, which had no handle, which would not open from the inside. He reached across to open it for me. He said, "Here, let me," and as his arm came across I was already moving, already pushing the door with both hands the moment the latch released, and I was out of the truck and onto the frozen gravel shoulder, and I ran. Not to the highway. Into the trees. The spruce were dense and dark and the ground was uneven, and I went down twice in the first 100 yards, tearing the knee of my pants the first time and losing a glove the second, and I kept moving. I heard the truck door. I heard his boots on the gravel. I did not hear him enter the trees, which was either because he hadn't or because the spruce swallowed sound, and I could not tell which, and not knowing was its own species of terror, the kind that makes you run harder because the alternative is finding out. I ran for what I later estimated was about 12 minutes. Then I stopped and crouched behind a deadfall and listened. The highway was visible through the trees. I could see the faint gray distinction between the road surface and the shoulder. I could see Ray's truck, parked, hazards not on, engine running. I watched it for 3 minutes without moving, without breathing audibly, one hand pressed flat against the frozen ground to feel for vibration. The cab light came on briefly. Then off. The truck sat. Then, slowly, it pulled back onto the highway and drove west. I lay in the snow behind the deadfall for a long time. I don't know exactly how long. Long enough that the cold had moved through my coat and the hand without the glove had lost sensation to the wrist. When I finally got up and moved back toward the highway, I was not entirely steady, the way you're not steady after something uses up your body's emergency reserves and leaves the ordinary systems to run on what remains. I stood on the shoulder in the dark. The highway was empty. The mountains were invisible. There was no sound except the wind in the spruce and the faint creak of a tree somewhere to the north, the cold working on the wood. I have been alone before. I have been lonely before, in the specific Alaskan way I described, the loneliness with room to expand. This was different. This was not the loneliness of geography or circumstance. This was the loneliness of having been, for 30 minutes, entirely inside someone else's intention, of having been the object of a plan that I did not know and could not fully reconstruct and would never entirely understand, and then being deposited back into the world that existed before that plan, which looked the same but was not. A family in a Jeep Grand Cherokee stopped 12 minutes later. A woman driving, 2 kids in the back seat asleep, a man in the passenger seat who got out while she kept the engine running and the doors locked except for the rear passenger, and he did not touch me, just stood at a distance and said, "Do you need help?" And I said yes, and he said, "Get in," and I got in, and the woman drove without asking me anything for the first 10 minutes, which was the kindest thing anyone could have done. They took me to the state trooper post in Palmer. I made a report. The trooper, a young man, careful, who wrote everything down, asked me to describe the truck, and I described it, and he wrote that down too. He asked about the door handle, and I described it, and something moved in his face that he controlled quickly, the movement of someone who has filed away a piece of information in a place where other pieces like it are kept. He did not say anything about Angela Sanders. I did not know to ask. I learned about her 4 months later, deep in an internet spiral at 2 in the morning, the kind of research that starts with Glen Highway missing persons and ends somewhere you can't unknow. Her photo was the standard missing persons format, a smiling picture from another context, a birthday or a graduation, the ordinary life that preceded the absence. She had brown hair. She had been heading to Glen Ellen. The case was open. There were no suspects named publicly. The investigation into my report produced nothing I was informed of. I received one follow-up call from the Palmer Post, asking me to confirm certain details of the truck's description. I confirmed them. I asked if they had identified the driver. The trooper said they were pursuing leads. He said it in the way that means, we have very little. The 8 event started 6 weeks after the highway. My doctor in Palmer, I had switched from the Glen Ellen Clinic, which required me to drive that road again, which I could not do, wrote the prescription with the careful language of someone calibrating a dosage against a documented trauma. She said the word trauma directly, which I appreciated. She said, "What happened to you was a specific and severe event, and your nervous system is responding to it the way nervous systems respond to specific and severe events, and that is not weakness, that is biology." I wrote that down. I read it back to myself on bad nights. The bad nights were frequent. They featured, in rotation, the clean cab of the truck, the beveled hole in the door, the pause before he pulled over, the sound of his boots on the gravel shoulder. They featured the spruce forest and the deadfall and the hand pressed flat against the frozen ground. They featured the highway, empty, the mountains invisible, the cold working through the coat. I had been alone on that shoulder in a way that no person should be allowed to be alone, without witness, without proximity to help, without the basic infrastructure of a society that had decided to be present for its members. Glen Ellen is 250 miles from Anchorage. The Glen Highway corridor is not watched. The people who use it are not tracked. A woman can disappear from it, and the investigation produces, 14 months later, no named suspects and an open case file and a photograph of a birthday party on a missing persons database that almost no one looks at. I gave notice on my rental in February. The landlord did not ask why. He had the look of a man who had watched enough people leave Glen Ellen to understand that the reasons were usually sufficient. I drove to Anchorage on the Parks Highway, not the Glen. I flew out of Ted Stevens International on a Wednesday morning in March, and when the plane climbed through the cloud layer and the mountains disappeared below the white, I felt something I had not expected. Not relief, not grief, but a kind of suspended stillness, like a held breath, like the moment between a question and its answer when both possibilities still exist. Miami was someone else's idea of a place to live. Hot, loud, dense, the air itself a physical presence, the city built on the premise that human beings want to be near each other and the infrastructure designed accordingly. I had a therapist within the first week, a woman on Brickell Avenue with an office full of afternoon light who had clearly worked with a lot of people arriving from places that had been too much and too empty simultaneously. She did not ask me to explain Alaska. She asked me to describe what safety felt like in my body. I told her I wasn't sure I remembered. We worked on that. We are still working on that. The 8 of it is half a dose now most nights, sometimes nothing, occasionally the full dose when the Glen Highway comes back in the dark with its tunnel of headlights and its empty shoulder and the sound of boots on gravel. My doctor here says the trajectory is good. I tell her I appreciate that. I mean it, more than she probably knows. I looked up Ray once. The description I gave, the truck, the approximate age, the stretch of highway, was enough to generate a theory, not a certainty, but a theory with a name attached to it that I won't write here. The name had a record. Not in Alaska, in a different state, a different highway, a different woman who had gotten out and run and reported what she'd experienced and been told by the investigating officer that a door handle, on its own, was not sufficient basis for an arrest. A door handle, on its own. As if the door handle were a separate fact, unconnected to the plan it was part of. Angela Sanders is still missing. I think about her on the bad nights, when the 8 of it hasn't done its full work and the Glen Highway comes back in pieces, the cold, the dark, the tunnel of headlights, the clean cab. I think about the 12 minutes between when I ran into the spruce and when I saw his truck pull back onto the highway. I think about what those minutes meant. I think about how close the margin was, and how the margin had nothing to do with strength or preparation or any quality of mind specifically. It had to do with nausea, with a performance, with a door that opened at exactly the right moment before it was fully decided whether to open it. Margins like that are not earned. They are stumbled into, and you carry them with you afterward, the knowledge of how thin they were, the knowledge of everything on the other side of them that you did not have to know. Some nights the knowledge is the last thing I think about before I sleep. Some nights the pill works fast enough that I don't think about anything. I have learned to be grateful for the nights that go that way.